Everyone, I'm Jon Torrens. I teach confident communication, and this is a beginner's guide to being hilarious. Three caveats. The first, which has been mentioned already, is this probably won't be that funny. Okay, so I think someone once said that comedy is a little bit like a frog, in that if you dissect it, you will learn a lot about it, but you will kill it. So much like other dissections of comedy, you'll learn a lot about it, but it might not necessarily be that amusing. Caveat number two, you probably won't be that much funny at the end of this. So in 18 minutes time, when I finish, I like to think of it a little bit like the introductory session at a gym. You won't be stronger and fitter by the end of that introductory session, but you will have the tools with which to do it. You'll have a path, you'll have a heading, and I like to think that I'm going to do the same for you today. Last caveat, comedy is a risky business, right? Whenever somebody asks me about it, I would say it's risky, it's dicey. You never know exactly what's going to happen, but I would say that the risk is probably worth it, because anything that fails, the significance of that is going to be far less than any of your successes. So caveats out of the way, let's get into it. I'm going to basically talk about what I think hilarity is, because maybe we can all recognize it easily, but I think it's worth looking at and defining. And secondly, how you can achieve it. And I use the word hilarious because it's kind of ironic. It's putting the pressure on yourself of like how to be funny, like that's a little bit arrogant. And so hilarious is the word that used to be used in the Radio Times when I was a kid. It would say, for the super short synopsis for the program description, man lives with a speaking dog with hilarious consequences. This is the sort of go-to, hey, it honestly, it is really funny, and now it's used ironically. Anyway, so that's why I chose that. But basically, this is about how I think you can be funny. So let's get into it. What is it? What does it mean? A few different things that I think define it. And I think the first is spontaneity. That's something that I learned from doing stand-up. I think it's my special super secret power. It's reacting to something in the moment. Sometimes it's just the speed of it. It should be something fairly funny, but the quicker it is, the better. And that is made up of a few different things as well. I think, as well as the speed, it's authenticity, right? This is something I talk about a lot. I'll be mentioning it a lot in this particular talk. It's being yourself. Now, no one wants to be themselves, because, why would you reveal what you're actually like? But being you and being completely open and honest, that can be a great way to be funny. I think there's also irreverence. Now, of course, when you're being completely open and honest, that doesn't necessarily mean you can be rude. And if you're rude, then that might affect how funny you're going to be. But there's something lovely about mocking something slightly casually, ruffling a few feathers, maybe pointing out what other people are thinking about something. So in Bake Off, Lottie went out. Lottie was the most interesting character by far, and they kicked her out. She said something brilliant a couple of weeks ago, where they were, it's all time pressure. And Peter, who's like the golden boy, who's brilliant at everything, he's a SWAT, he was making little bits of holly. And I think Matt or someone said to her, how are you feeling? Are you feeling pressure? He goes, yeah, I'm doing pretty badly, but Peter isn't, he's making holly. And it was just that little moment of just pointing out, here's a thing that's happening with a little bit of a sarcastic edge, which was very, very funny. She should have stayed in, Peter should have gone weeks ago. Anyway, the point is, it's being a little bit irreverent, but also not just knocking something. So a great British tradition is to say that something is rubbish, right? We're great at that, we love doing it. But a stand-up comic, and I will refer to stand-up comics quite a lot in this, obviously, will point out that something is rubbish. They'll point out why, but then they'll point out the solution. So suggesting an improvement, I think, is really important to show you've kind of analyzed it. But that honesty, that openness, I think it really comes from a sort of don't care attitude. Again, you've got to balance that with offending people. But I find most of the people I work with, a lot of people I know, maybe it's a British tradition, we're so terrified of offending people that we don't open up. And keeping it simple, getting to the point, that immediate dissection of what's happened, talking about what's happening in the moment, I think that can be very funny. And the last thing I'll say about the spontaneity is that there can be an utter joy to it. I think the happiest moments I've had, some of the happiest moments of my life, have been sharing a joke with workmates. It's just been in that everyday, that familiar, because we know each other so well, we know what we all love and hate, but we're completely comfortable with each other. So that spontaneity, and I've had fun at drive meetings, saying stupid stuff, but it's just in that moment. There's something lovely about that. So that's the first thing, is the spontaneous. And that's a difficult thing, right? I learned how to do that doing stand-up. It was something that I had to really sort of work on. It's hard, but it's definitely something that you can develop and work on. The second form I find, and maybe this is kind of the complete opposite with funny stuff, is the prepared, the rehearsed, the written. So I'm thinking of TV sitcoms, and I'm thinking of stand-up comics who, whilst they want you to think are freestyling the whole thing, I'd say 90% at least of a stand-up comedian's stuff has been written, it has been rehearsed, it has been tried out hundreds of times until it is absolutely right. The joke writer knows that if you've got something that is funny, the shorter you can make it, the better. So some comics will become obsessed with removing individual words just to get it absolutely right. That simplicity I find can be very funny. One thing with the comics, though, I would say, is it's not necessarily the timing. Sometimes there's this thing where people say, "Oh, I love this comic's timing." I would argue that timing is no greater a component of being funny than anything else. Certainly, it's the bit when the funny thing happened. But in the same way, you wouldn't say, Rafael Nadal, is a brilliant tennis player. You just say they're a brilliant tennis player. You wouldn't say they're really accurate. Yes, they can certainly put the ball when they want to, and that's the moment when they win the point. But without agility, endurance, and everything else, they're not going to be a great tennis player. So that's just a little aside. If someone's funny, they're funny. That's it. There's no point in breaking it down. It feels stupid saying they've got good jokes, but that's what it is. So as part of the written stuff as well, I find the really good writing is quotable. So if you see a stand-up comic and they've got a particularly good bit of stuff, it survives retelling. When I was at school and Blackadder and The Young Ones were on, which I loved, that dialogue was amazing. It got quoted the next day. And of course, we were in a world when if we'd watched it, then probably everyone else had watched it as well. And those little one-liners, what an original perfume, these things like survived for years and years afterwards, to the point where, of course, they were repeated so much that they stopped being funny. But those brilliant bits of writing can survive, and that could be a joke that you're telling somebody else. But really good writing, it can survive in that way. But I'd say another part of the prepared hilarity is context and situation. So Rowan Atkinson, who obviously I'm a fan of, said that in real life, he's quite boring. And he said people are surprised that he can't make them laugh when they meet him. And he said, yeah, he thinks he's quite a quiet, dull person who happens to be a performer. If you were in a comedy club and there was no one else in the audience, I imagine that comic would only get a few chuckles from you. Put another 500 people in there, or even better, another 5,000 if you've paid to see that person in concert, the funniest night of your life, the most amazing thing that's ever happened. So it's relative, and it comes back to that familiarity as well. I remember playing at the Comedy Store in Clapham Common, Clapham, and you'd have groups. It would just be groups of like hen nights and stag nights, and they're all having a great time within their own little bubble. So the spontaneous, the spark, and then the carefully honed and the prepared. Of all of those, though, I think the thing that I really find funny, and I don't know if it defines all comedy, it's misfortune, it's failure, right? I will happily watch fail videos on my phone for about an hour. It's people falling over, it's people hurting themselves. You've Been Framed is people falling over. That's all it's ever been. They're doing something, it goes wrong, and it hurt. Hooray! Like, what a horrible thing that we would find that funny. And I was wondering why we find that funny, and I realized it's not just here's this other person who I'm laughing at who's an idiot. It's that I can relate to it. So I've laughed at Basil Fawlty and Alan Partridge and David Brent, and I think you're idiots, but I've been there too. I've done a little bit of that. So there's a relatable aspect to it. And with that in mind, personal stories of massive failure are great, right? If you can relate something like that, I just think it's wonderful. The day when everything goes wrong, on the day itself, horrific, right? You wish it never happened. A year down the line, or even better, a few years down the line, funniest thing ever, because it's kind of someone else's misfortune. It is yours, but it's you in the past. Charlie Chaplin apparently said, comedy is tragedy plus time. Now, I would argue that I certainly don't think that all comedy is tragedy, but there's a reason those two masks are comedy and tragedy. They are kind of two sides of the same thing, perhaps. But I don't think the tears of a clown thing is a necessity. I don't think you have to suffer at all to be funny. So yes, Tony Hancock and Robin Williams, Tommy Cooper, yes, they may have been desperately unhappy and incredibly funny, but you don't have to suffer to be funny. That story of something going wrong could be something you confess, but you don't have to have had a dreadful time in order to be funny. Right, so that's me encapsulating all of hilarity in 11 and a half minutes. But how can you achieve it, right? What's the alchemy? Well, I think it's being authentic. So I mentioned this at the beginning with the spontaneity. It's the trickiest thing you'll ever do. I still think I'm trying to do it. It's a real challenge, because why would you open up? Why would you show people what you're really like? But I think this is where it comes from. I would argue that being funny isn't necessarily jokes, unless you're a stand-up comic. Don't think that it has to be jokes. Anne and I were talking about the LinkedIn article ages ago said, "Oh, comedy works better for men than it does for women," and they'd added jokes, or they'd added humor, and clearly they told some jokes, which is rubbish, right? So I think it's honesty and spontaneity for its own sake. So you're not trying to be funny. Like, that can be very unfunny. I think you're being open and honest, and if it's funny, hey, it's a bonus, right? You're not trying to make people laugh. I think it comes from puncturing tension. There's an idea that if specifically with a joke, the joke is the someone blowing up a balloon, and the punchline is the pin that punches it. If there's an awkward moment, that can be great for some comedy. If there's a silence, that can be great for some comedy. It relieves what's happening. So there was something online with some terrible Trump supporter coming up behind someone and yelling at them. It was some official in the States. Sorry, I've got no details. And he let this guy just go rant, and then went, right, where were we? That was really funny, because he just cast it aside completely. So self-acceptance is a big thing with being authentic. And we're all works of progress. Accepting yourself fully is really hard. I think I'm still kind of struggling with it, but certainly I found that I've been making lots of videos recently, and I found in the ones where I go, do you know what? I'm just going to do something. So I've worn a Punisher t-shirt, which I would never consider doing, or a Spider-Man t-shirt, whatever, and just have some fun with it. At the end of one of them, I think it was the Punisher t-shirt one, I finished and I went, that was a good one. And I kept that in there because I thought it was funny. And well, I don't know what people think, whether they think it's funny or not, but I liked that. So I think it comes down to giving yourself permission. Being open and honest is really hard. Again, you've got to balance it with being, offensive versus being funny. Hey, maybe those two things go together, but it's letting go. It's removing your ego. It's speaking without fear of judgment. So I might be really curious. Let's say I meet someone with a disability. I want to talk to them about that. If I would say, right, are you okay with it? Because I just want to talk about it. I want to find out. It's not mocking. It's not ignoring it completely for fear of offense. I'm genuinely interested. And if they're not okay with it, then they'll tell me that. But generally, I find if someone has something unusual about them and I want to know about it, then they're fine to talk about it. But it's in the same way, say, a child might say to me, like a 5-year-old might say, oh, you've got no hair, or why haven't you got any hair? And their parents might be mortified, but I'd love to talk about it. I don't mind at all. but they've asked it without fear of judgment. It's just, I'm curious about this thing, tell me about it. I've talked a lot about being professional in inverted commas. And again, Anne and I have talked about this, this idea that it's not professional to be silly, to be authentic, to be yourself, to be irreverent, to wear casual clothes. I would argue that that's a really big part of connecting with people and being funny. It's speaking the unspoken. It's saying the thoughts that everyone else is thinking. I found owning up to stuff that I've got wrong and stupid things I've done often elicits a response, which is a confession from other people as well. Yeah, I've done that as well. And suddenly we all feel better that we've all messed this thing up. And that's funny. It's punctured the tension. You were worried about this thing. We shared it. We found out that everyone does it. Hooray, right? That really works. And you've got to be able to go with the flow. So another tennis reference, actually, Tim Henman was asked about, what about decisions that go against you? And he said, well, basically, it goes both ways. So there'll be bad decisions that go against you, and there'll be ones that go with you, that are for you. So you have to accept those. And that thing goes bad, yeah, there'll be a good thing along pretty soon. I think trying to make it look like you're being funny, like make it apparent that you're trying to be funny is pretty terrible. I would say hit and run. If you say a funny thing in a meeting, great. Please, for God's sake, don't try and repeat your amazing thing. Let people remember that funny thing you said, that's it. And I've done it. I've gone, oh, I'll do another one. I'll do another one. No, just hit and run. So I would conclude, I mean, I've got some 5 killer things to sum up with, but just before I do that, it's being the person that you want to be, if that doesn't sound too pretentious, because that might be the person that other people want to be. You're open, you're honest, you're content with yourself, you speak your mind. That's funny. And I would argue quite attractive as well. If you're just speaking your mind, you're being polite, but you want to say what other people are thinking, you want to say what you're thinking. That's just funny. So 5 things. Be yourself. React with honesty and humility. Tell stories of failure. It's just funny, right? It's human and it's relatable. Practice, right? None of this will count for anything unless you put it into action. You've got to practice. You've got to try it out. It can be really hard, but it won't always work, but it's generally worth the risk. Trying to, as long as it's not actually a joke, just saying something that might be amusing. If it doesn't work, it's fine. If it does work, that's gold. That's yours to reuse another time. And finally, have fun. If you go into any kind of situation with the objective of having fun, obviously you'll be trying to enjoy it, but you'll probably be funny as a consequence. And that is it. That is my guide on how to be hilarious. Thank you.